Hello and welcome to my studio. Today I am going to paint this crimson rose petal. Now the first thing I've done for this is I have mixed my shadow color, which is here and which is this color, and I've used my technique called harmonic shadows, which is mixing three primary colors that I'm going to find in the subject to make a grey to do the shadows. So the three colors I've chosen are permanent rose, because there's a lot of pink in that petal shining through the red, and you can see it even more at the back. And then tallow blue red shade, because it's a violet bias blue that is not granulating, and then Hansa yellow light, which is a very transparent lemon yellow, because there's a slight hint of yellow here, and that gives me this grey. So I'm putting my petal next to my little drawing, and the first thing I'm going to do on this is paint the shadows. So I'm going to paint these wet in wet. I'm using a synthetic brush, as always, giving me a bit more control, carrying a bit less water. So I'm putting the shadows in quite roughly. And I can go quite dark with them because it's quite a strongly coloured petal. So it can take a bit of shadows. If I go too light, they're just not going to show through at all, and they're not going to give the 3D effect that I'm trying to achieve. I'm also dragging my brush through the shadows to break the wash a little bit, and starting to give a hint of the direction the veins are going in. And it's very important not to overwork when you do your washes, because if you overwork it, if you work for too long, you're going to start scrubbing the paper, you're going to start disturbing the washes while they're in the process of drying, and that will make some very uneven washes, and you're going to lose the softness that you would get with more spontaneous washes. Once the shadows have dried, we're ready for the second coat. It's that little blotch of yellow here, which I'm going to do straight away, because I don't want to forget about it. I don't want to risk covering it by accident. And then the first wash is my pink, so that's permanent rose or quinacridone pink, and the first thing I'm doing is covering the shadows. And as I'm applying the wash, you can see that I'm following the way that the veins are going always, so that I don't start brushing across and giving the wrong texture. And although I have to keep in mind where the shadows are and where the highlights are, at this stage mainly I want to keep that white. That's my main concern, because it's white around that little yellow bit, so I don't want my pink to go too close to that, because the highlights on the rose petals are actually not white, so even if I put some pink on there, it doesn't matter. In fact, I'm going to put some pink on purpose, because it's a velvety texture, and velvety textures do not have highly reflective highlights, so they're not white. They're sort of reddish, pinky, crimson colour, which will be done by layering my pink and my red. Now here I'm going to push the paint back a little bit, and I've got a piece of cloth here to wipe my brush, and if I do that while it's wet, there will be no trouble in getting my white back here. If I waited for it to dry, permanent rose being a staining colour, I would be stuck and I wouldn't be able to do it. My next wash is quinacridone fuchsia. So if you don't have quinacridone fuchsia, you can use permanent alizarin crimson and add a little bit of your magenta to it, and that will do it. And again, I'm wetting the whole area, and I start with covering the shadows and then I extend into the mid-tones. I'm not going too close to the yellow here because it's actually quite pink around that pink bit here. And then finally I rinse my brush and I extend into the highlight, smoothing the edges of the wash that I've just put down. Pushing back a bit to retrieve that pink. And adding a bit more before it dries. And you can see that at this stage it's looking too magenta, too pink, but these are only the underlayers before I go with my red. So these are all the colours that will shine through the top layers. So I went to pluck another Petal because the one I was using at the end of last week when I started the video it's kind of changed colour and it's very shriveled. So my next colour is gonna be a strong proper red, which in Daniel Smith is called Petal red, and that is a sort of mid red. So I'm covering my shadows, I'm covering my mid-tones, and I'm avoiding the highlights. As long as the paint is wet, I can keep on adding colour. I've let this dry and now I am wetting it again. And the next wash is anthraquinoid red, if you have, like me, if you have Daniel Smith colours. Or it could be a permanent alizarin crimson if you work with a different brand. And this colour is a really nice deep crimson colour. And remember that the highlights and the folds on that petal are not the same ones as the petal I am painting, because I changed my petal halfway through. So I'm continuing to work with the information I had put down from the other petal, but with this petal I'm only referring to the colour. And while this is still wet, I'm dropping in some pink, so that's quinacridone pink or permanent rose. Okay, we're almost finished with the wet in wet. One more wash just to add a bit more colour, because frankly at that point there is a lot of paint on there. So I'm dropping some quinacridone fuchsia, which is my slightly magenta red, and I'm dropping this over the shadows and the mid-tones, but not on the highlights. And then in the same wash, some of the Petal red, which is more of the mid-red, which I'm dropping close to the highlights. And then still in the same wash, the anthraquinoid red or permanent alizarin crimson, if you don't have anthraquinoid red. And that's over the shadows, in the mid-tones, close to the highlights, a little bit everywhere, because that's the colour that is just in between the other two, so it's going to link everything. And then a bit of the pink around here, whatever pink you are using. And while that is still wet, I'm using a flat brush to lift up some of the paint into the body of the petal. And I have to do that while it's wet so that I'm not damaging the paper. And then a bit more lifting around the main highlights. I have left the petal to dry completely, and now I am going to draw in a few veins. So I'm going with my darkest red, which is either your anthraquinoid red or your permanent alizarin crimson. So I'm going in with this not very watery paint, and I'm going to draw the central vein and then some other veins coming out of that. Now when it goes over very dark bits, it won't show very much, but that's okay, because when you look at the real petal, the veins don't show everywhere, you just get a hint of them from place to place, and that's the effect you want to have. So you don't want to draw every single vein from base to tip. You want a hint of where they're going, and that might include going one across the highlight here, but you have to blend it in straight away so that it doesn't stand out too much. It needs to be part of the structure of the petal itself, not just added on, so you have to blend everything you do. And also make sure you observe your petal very well. So that you don't start painting veins in the wrong places. That will look completely unnatural. Just a couple more across the highlight. Sort of disappearing as I'm doing them, so that's very good, because that means they're blending very well. They're disappearing, but they're still there, just as a hint of texture, without looking too obvious. Okay, that's it for the rose petal. So as usual, I will post this video on my public channel on YouTube, but I will also make a longer paint-along version for my Patreon subscribers. Thank you so much for subscribing to my Patreon site. I hope you're enjoying all the contents I'm putting on there. I will also put in the box below a link to a blog post I've done of this tutorial, because then you can see all the paint names written down, which might help, especially with things like anthraquinoid red. And I will also post a link to my Etsy shop, where you can buy a downloadable PDF version of this tutorial to go with the video. I hope you enjoyed the video. Now it's your turn to go and play with all your reds and paint a rose petal, and I'll see you soon in another video. Happy painting! Thank you! Bye!